Welcome to episode 38 of Feeling Through Live. I have the pleasure to be joined by my dear friend Rebecca Alexander, who's far overdue in joining us. We've been playing like Zoom tag for quite a while now, but it's really an honor to have you here. And before I have you maybe introduce yourself, I'm going to start off by doing an image description of myself and the screen, and then once I pass it over to you, if you could start off with an image description, that would be great. I am a white male in my mid-30s, short dark hair, little scruff on my face. I'm wearing a blue button-up shirt, and the screen that we have today in the top left corner says Feeling Through Live, episode 38, DeafBlind Representation in Film. Top right corner is our interpreter, who will be signing throughout. And in the bottom right corner, Rebecca, if you take away your image description there.
So, hi everyone, I am Rebecca Alexander, and I am coming to you live from New York City in my apartment where I've been for the last, it seems 10 years, but maybe it's been just over a year given COVID. So, I am wearing a green sweater. My hair is dark brown and long. I am of the Caucasian persuasion, and my mini golden doodle monkey is sitting behind me. I believe for you guys, it is on your, if it's on my right, it's on your left. And she could not look any less impressed. She's looking away from the screen. I have my gray couch behind me and a framed photo behind me of sort of like a brick door. It's not entirely clear what it is, but it was a picture I really liked because it had different colors that I could see pretty well when I bought it some time ago. So, and I'm really happy to be here with all of you.
What do we have to do to impress Monkey enough to have Monkey like be more jazzed about our conversation?
I mean, as soon as you find out, let me know.
Okay. Well, in that case, as long as Monkey's not barking at us. But, there's one of the reasons I'm been so excited to have you on is because, we got a chance to connect a few years ago now before Feeling Through was ever a thing that people were able to see. And, you've been such an amazing, first like mentor in this space when we first met each other, but really just become a really great friend. And we've had the opportunity to talk about so many different topics. And I feel like I've benefited so much from being friends with you and just learning about all different types of things in the world. So there's so many things we can talk about and certainly will get to today. But, one of the things that I've thought through the context of, what Feeling Through platform is, and obviously something that's been a really notable thing in your life as of late, has been the topic of representation in film, and specifically deafblind representation in film. And, can you explain to everyone a little bit about your memoir and why we're also connecting it to film in this case?
Sure. So I wrote a memoir that I think it came out like 2014, 2015. And the memoir was about living with Usher syndrome type 3, which is the leading genetic cause of deafblindness in this country and around the world. But I decided to write a memoir. Actually, I was approached some years before when I did a big fundraiser for just raising money for vision research. And some people found out about it and they said, oh, that's interesting, deafblindness. What must that be like living in New York City? And I was approached by a literary agent, and I was, 28 at the time. And I was thinking, I was almost embarrassed at the idea of writing a memoir at 28. Like it felt very sort of self-indulgent. And then some time passed, and I realized in my own process of coming to terms with my own identity as not a sighted hearing person and not a blind deaf person, but somewhere in this gray area where people are most uncomfortable in the gray, right? I found that reading other people's memoirs, no matter what their circumstances were, whether they were a prisoner of war or whether they were someone who had, was raised in a cult, that there were all of these sort of commonalities, there are these similarities that I think we all have that really boils down to simply being the nature of the human condition. And so I decided that some years later, when the same literary agent approached me again, I said, all right, let's do this. And so I did it, and in 2016 or so, I was approached about making my memoir into a film. And of course, you know better than I do in Hollywood that takes a long time. And every time I would speak to somebody in Hollywood about what progress was being made, I felt like I needed to take 2 or 3 showers afterwards because it just felt sort of very Hollywood icky. And so here we are. And recently, now, since COVID, the rights have been sold to Netflix, and it's in development now. So I thought this might be an opportune time, and more importantly, to talk about feeling through, and just, there's nothing that I felt sort of more inspired and encouraged by that you did the more difficult thing by really searching out someone who would be most appropriate to play Artie, and going to Helen Keller National Center, and sort of making this more of a movement instead of just a movie for people to go and see, be maybe touched by, and then leave. That you actually are giving a voice, that you're actually creating this sense of inclusion for so many of us with deafblindness. So I can't tell you how meaningful that has been for so many of us in this community.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. I really appreciate that. And, I'm excited to get into talking about the nuances of what your experience has been in Hollywood so far and just around the topics of representation. But before we do that, just to kind of to touch on your memoir a little bit more and what you so, beautifully brought up is that ultimately, and by the way, I'd like to note, I believe there's people like Justin Bieber that had like memoirs or films about their lives when they were like half that age. So I don't think you should feel weird about that. I think there's like 12-year-olds out there that have memoirs. So maybe no need to feel weird about that. But what I think that's so great about what you were just saying is that, ultimately, and I think it's something that people are starting to have more awareness about, but identity is not this like thing that you can very cleanly fit into like a handful of boxes. It's something that there are as many people as there are in the world. You'll find as many unique ways to identify. Obviously, it's a little bit more, I think, apparent that diversity in some people more than others. But in your case, as someone who and obviously you can speak much more in depth about this than myself, but with Usher syndrome and just the deafblind community as a whole, deafblindness can manifest in infinite number of ways and happen in any number of stages that your identity, it's very proof that your identity is this ever evolving thing. It's not this fixed thing that you're like, oh, this is just who I am and this is who I'm always going to be. It's something that evolves. Can you speak a little bit more about the evolution of like your identity in any way you'd want to talk about that?
Sure. So, I was raised in a hearing and sighted family. And I was diagnosed when I was, I think, 12 with RP, which is the vision part of what I have. And then later, I think that we knew I had what they called like a cookie bite of hearing loss when I was maybe, I don't know, 13 or something like that. I can't even remember now. It kind of all blends in. But it wasn't until later, when I was in college, I was at the University of Michigan, and one day I just woke up and I had really loud ringing in my ears. And the feeling was that I couldn't hear people sort of speak to me over that. I had hearing aids at the time, but I don't know if it was because I was like a teenager still, or if I just really wanted to not think about these two senses being connected. I don't know. But that day that I woke up, the sensation was that the ringing was so loud, it was almost paralyzing. I couldn't hear it felt like I couldn't hear anybody speak to me over it. It felt like I couldn't get away from it. And I couldn't, because it was in my head, right? And I felt like I was going insane. And so and the only thing that helped it was when I put my hearing aids on. And so after about a week or so, it wasn't sort of getting better. So I went to the Kellogg Eye Clinic, which is at the University of Michigan. And they did a lot more testing, and they said, Rebecca, you have Usher syndrome. We've never seen it as it sort of presents itself in you, but because you have, both progressive vision and hearing loss, it can't be anything else. So it was a long process of, the Human Genome Project was helpful. My mom was very dedicated to figuring out what this genetic mutation was, because Usher type 3 had not yet been identified. And we happened to find these researchers in Helsinki, Finland, who had this very small population of people. And my family overnighted our blood work to these researchers. This was about 10 years after my diagnosis. And it turns out that our blood work was that missing link, and that Usher syndrome type 3 had been identified. But I mentioned this long, boring story because it really means that there was no roadmap. It wasn't like, I was told I was going to be blind by the age of 30. I'm 42 now, and I think I have probably about 10 degrees of my centralmost vision. I have donut vision. Many of us with vision loss experience very different types of vision. I see everything on a spectrum. And as you mentioned, people like to sort of put something in a very neat and tidy box, and nothing is neat and tidy. Nothing about life is neat and tidy. And the more neat and tidy it is, the more uncomfortable I am, because to me, it's just a sort of a covering up or a facade of something much deeper and more complicated. So I think going through this process of having to figure all this out on my own, of being in some ways the pioneer of Usher syndrome type 3, really sort of gave me the opportunity to get to know myself and figure out what it was that I needed to do to feel a greater sense of confidence and a greater sense of ability to accept myself. And it was a very long process, and it still is. But I can tell you that the level of intimacy that I have with my friends and my life and my family now is absolutely because of my deafblindness. And I don't know who I would be if I was a fully sighted hearing person. Being deafblind is a very, very difficult thing to live with, not because being deafblind is particularly a problem. It's that everybody else is sort of, the world itself is not cut out for people like us. So, we are constantly having to adjust ourselves in ways that are not even possible. And so I think for my own coming to terms, it's been a huge process in me learning to use my voice and not speak up for myself from a place of anger, but speak up for myself from a place of confidence and from a place of wanting other people to understand so that they can communicate and do better in terms of how they interact with the world, and particularly with people who have disabilities and deafblindness.
And I think, in getting to know you both personally and, at the more public figure side of you, I think that's something that you do so beautifully, knowing that basically all environments that you find yourself in are these extremely nuanced ones where there are a lot of people who don't really have the language and understanding of them, which can lead to a lot of pretty severe misconceptions and erroneous, understandings about them. And I think what you're able to navigate it so well because you come off so genuinely as having such a strong sense of self, connecting it to identity, and having, as you described, it sounds like the journey of what you've dealt with in your life that's been the benefit of it, of you having to almost be forced to really understand yourself in a more intimate way than maybe some people have not necessarily had the same necessity at certain times in the way that you have. But I think that's something that's so apparent in knowing you, a lot of different sides of you. And I think that is a interesting segue to talking about how we deal with these topics in storytelling and in film, because I think something that is happening right now, and it feels like a pretty recent thing, is that there is, again, largely out of a little bit of bending the arm of Hollywood, if you will, being more receptive, the industry being more receptive to starting to understand and listen to authentic casting and what that means and why it's important, and maybe follow through on it a little bit more than previously. But there's still obviously a long way to go, and the language in that space we haven't really necessarily, we're still working towards a nuance, because I think there's a lot of people who are in positions of power in that space who are very new to a lot of these understandings. So, with that said, I guess, what has this process been like for you so far? Knowing that you couldn't have something more intimate and personal to you than your own life story and yourself being portrayed on screen, dealing with any number of people, some of which who are probably learning about deaf blindness for the very first time, whoever you've been dealing with on the Hollywood side of things. What's that process been like for you so far?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think that sometimes when, so I don't represent the entire deafblind community. That's not possible. It's not possible for someone to represent the entire transgender community. It's not possible for someone to represent the Asian American community, African American, anything. We are all sort of individuals, and we may share similar experiences. And I think that we share more similar experiences than we ever allow for ourselves to recognize. And I think that one of the gifts of having something like Usher syndrome is that I often try to see what the similarities are that we have. Or more importantly, I love to go somewhere, and because we all have preconceived ideas of who a person is, or where they come from, or what their education level may be, or their income level, or whatever it is based on wherever we come from. I love being proved wrong. I love being aware of my first impression and not saying this is who this person is, but saying I can't wait for you to be proved wrong. And I do that with myself, because I think that we are all sort of conditioned that way. And to say that we aren't, I think, is completely dishonest. But so, here's what I'll tell you. It's interesting because when, a few years ago, and I can't even remember how many years ago, because 2020 like feels like 12 years. So I don't remember what time looks like anymore. But a few years ago, there was an announcement that was made on social media. And it was that Emily Blunt was going to be playing Rebecca Alexander in Not Fade Away. Now, I got this news just as everybody else did. And I was in session with patients, and like all of a sudden I was in between sessions running to the bathroom. I looked at my phone and I had like 20 text messages, and people were like, congrats, like, I'm so excited for you. And I had no idea what they were talking about, right? And so then someone told me this was announced. Now, I don't know that Emily knew any better than I did, but this announcement was made for whatever reason and by whomever. And I sort of felt like, okay, it was so surreal. It was strange. And in addition to that, a little bit later, I was asked by a big disability organization to MC an event that they were, putting on, and they were going to be recognizing a famous person. And so I wanted to see what this organization was about. And so I just went online to look at it. And my assistant at the time, told me, I think you need to go to that website and see what they have there. And it turns out that on their homepage, they had an entire campaign of actresses who were low vision or who were blind or whatever, who were like auditioning to play Rebecca Alexander in this role. And it was like this whole disability rights movement, and that there needs to be representation. And I was so taken aback because both communities disappointed me, right? Like, there's a saying in the disability community, and it's a very large community. It's the largest minority community in the world, as we know, and made up of a very diverse group of people. But I was disappointed because of the saying that goes on in the disability community: nothing about us without us. And the fact that I was not asked about how I felt about this, nobody approached me from this, even from this organization, and that these women were going on and sort of doing this audition. And like, listen, I can appreciate that it was, maybe just for to catch attention or to really sort of make a point. Whatever the case was, I was disappointed. And I told them, and that was the last I've heard from that organization. And what I can tell you is that historically, many of my deaf-blind friends have told me and have experienced that even with their deaf friends, that losing their vision, becoming deaf-blind, has been a very difficult process for them in communicating with their friends as well. Because when you're signing, your hands, that's your voice. So when people are covering your hands to feel what you're signing, that's a transition. That's a process that you need to sort of adapt to, right? And so I didn't necessarily think that a visually impaired woman was necessarily the most appropriate, because a visually impaired woman or may not understand the deaf world any better. So the point is, there was no conversation with me first. And so it's sort of this weird gray nuanced place. And it's made me have to sort of think a lot about this whole sort of situation and what representation looks like. Yeah.
I have one other friend whose memoir was made into a movie. That a big movie star played him, and I was equally shocked to hear how little he was ever consulted about any step of the way at all. And so I just find that like a bizarre thing in general, that why you wouldn't want at least at some points to go to the source and talk to them when they're readily available in this case. But that aside, I'm wondering, because you started to point out how, authentic, just to talk about authentic representation for a moment, and like what it has meant, at least in Hollywood as of late, is that, through the lens of disability, in this case, the disability community, it means casting actors who are disabled in roles that are written as disabled characters. Historically, there's been very, very few roles written as a disabled character, even though, as Rebecca, as you pointed out, the disability community is the largest minority group in the world, and by any accounts constitutes as many as a fifth to a quarter of people in the United States alone. Historically, it's been something like 5% of characters in major TV shows and movies are written as having a disability, and more problematic than that is, of that small percentage, historically, a very, very low percentage have actually been played by actors with disabilities. They've often been played by actors who don't have disabilities. And the real issue here is the fact that there are obviously a lot of people who have great talent, who have disabilities, who deserve to have opportunities like anyone else would. And certainly when it comes to a character that's written as a disability, not even getting to the fact that actors with disabilities should be considered for any role, really, or like most roles at least, as we kind of ripple that out and get better with that. But with that said, your specific life story highlights a really unique things around what authentic representation means in this specific case. Again, as you well described earlier, identity is not something that fits in a neat box, and deaf blindness isn't something that fits in a neat box. There's such a diverse manifestation of it, yours being its own unique one compared to anyone else who's a person who's deaf blind. So it's not just about, again, oh, this person is deaf and blind, they're perfect fit for this. There's a lot of things to consider. How would you talk about, now that you've had some time to sit with this, and obviously it may be something that's still evolving, what comes up for you as kind of the right way to go about this, or kind of best practices as we start to talk about where authentic representation fits in specifically with your story, your memoir being optioned, and the best way to go about thinking about casting that role?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of changes that have happened in the time since the rights were first optioned. I think I'm now on the fifth option. So it's been over 5 years since they first optioned it. So a lot of kind of change and new characters and people have come and gone and whatever. I've never had my story told, even though, New York Magazine and these various stories various outlets have told my story. None of them had ever really gotten it right, so to speak, because they always have their angle, their lens. And I have to assume that that is going to happen again here, right? I mean, remember, this is my life that they're going to be representing, that I'm almost 42 years old. So this was the time when I was in my early 30s. I'm a much different person. My vision and hearing loss is much different now. I mean, in the book, I was cochlear implanted on one side. I'm now cochlear implanted on both sides. My preference is to not have my ears on. There is nothing I love more than being deaf, because it is my religion. It is sort of my safe space. And when I first started losing, my hearing, it was so difficult for me to be with myself in my own head because of how loud the tinnitus and the ringing and the auditory hallucinations and all that stuff was. So, and I know I've sort of sidetracked here, but to get back onto the point, I think I'm really eager I want people to be more flexible with their minds. So maybe this movie, and we've talked about this, I think people are like, oh, we want to get the best director and someone who's famous and has done all this work. I don't care if you're famous. I don't care if you've won 6 Academy Awards. I mean, and I know that we don't have the budget for that anyway, but I want someone who has that willingness to see outside of themselves, outside of their vision. I want someone who is comfortable being incredibly uncomfortable and sitting with that. And that's exactly what you did when you went to Helen Keller, right? And when you had to learn and be a part of, communicating and creating the space for an authentic actor. So, one of the things, the director that they've chosen, I really like. We've gotten to know each other, and she seems to have this flexibility. I mean, we're still a ways off, but one of the things we've talked about is starting the movie and having someone who is a sighted hearing actress. And then as the movie progresses and the vision loss and hearing loss happens, that the main actress is a totally different actress who does have vision and hearing loss, or who does, we don't know yet. But even that willingness to have that flexibility and to ask the viewer to sort of suspend their, reality for a moment, to try to really kind of capture what it's like. I don't know. I really appreciated that. And so this is something that I'm really going through. And I have to tell you, one of my biggest concerns really is the backlash that I'm going to get. We are so quick to judge and to criticize. And, social media, I think I understand how incredible it is that we can all be together today and have this conversation. But people they have no qualms about just attacking anyone for any reason because of their own shit in their own lives. And so I'm really eager for people to sort of maybe be open-minded and to really start having this dialogue. And I'm really, hopeful that this will continue to open that dialogue and less sort of criticism.
And, I think such a great example that you just brought up, again, whether it happens or not, is, that example of the possibility of, switching actors at some point in the story to more accurately exemplify, obviously in a poetic way, but more accurately exemplify the transformations and changes that you were going through in your personal story. Again, as we get back to this point about the fact that we are very young in our the general public's, general society's understanding and language around these nuanced topics. Mm-hmm. I mean, for people who aren't part of the community, and in this case, even a specific part of the deafblind community, they're probably have never thought about any of the things that are needing to be thought about in representation in your story, let alone anything that even comes close to relating to it oftentimes. So as we understand that film is meant to be shared with lots of different types of people, to come together and have some sort of communal experience, and obviously have our own takeaways from the story ultimately, knowing that you can't appease all people all the time, what is kind of the best solution ultimately, and what are ways which we can be creative, knowing that we're working in this context where maybe we can't do the things we really want to do yet because we're not there yet in the language and the mass understanding around it. And how do we work with the context that we're in right now and the resources we have and the understandings we have to do the best possible job we can? And it's such your story in particular is brings kind of exposes where we need to really dig deeper. I think it's such a great, because of the intersectionality there, and the really and the very unique journey that you've been on personally. It really does expose kind of like where we need to grow and evolve. I'm gonna hold for just one moment while we do an interpreter switch.
Mm-hmm.
All right, we're continuing here. But yeah, I'm wondering, you said that there's been an evolution of even within the time that your story was first optioned. I'm wondering, as best as you can define that, what would you, from your own perspective, what do you feel like that evolution is, and kind of where does it feel like we're headed with these topics?
That's a good question. I what I'm like most hopeful for is that my story will just continue to open up this space and this dialogue. One thing that I think about, and I'm sure I'll get backlash on this too, is that, what's interesting is that now when you have like a Zoom, or if you have an email, signature or whatever, you have to include she, her, or they, them, or he, him. And part of the reason why I think that has been able to sort of catch on so quickly is because people have a voice, literally. They can speak, they can communicate their needs. But when you're a deaf-blind person, or when you're a deaf person, your voice is always being interpreted. You always need to find someone to help you communicate your needs. So the fact that today we're able to say, even for the low vision and blind community, we're able to do the audio description. I honestly think that would be a requirement, and it would catch on as quickly as the she, her, they, them, he, him, if we had that type of access, if we had the ability to communicate that freely and easily and comfortably with the world, right? And so that I think is something that I hope will continue to progress with even sharing my story. Now, I know so many people who have a very different, deaf-blind experience than I do. I mean, I think if you ask me, for example, so, one person that we all know very well in sort of this community, Maricar, has an incredible story. I would love, and her story is so different than mine. I would love to see a movie about her story. I would love for this not to be sort of like the only story. And now we can't do a movie about that. Why? Because it's been done before. I really hope that this sort of brings this more to the forefront, and that we're not focusing on this being about someone with deaf blindness. We're focusing on who we are as people. The same way that you look at a hearing sighted person who's very complicated, who has their own sort of experiences that really make them resilient, that make them vulnerable. And so I really hope that they can capture more than just the deaf blindness. That, I'm someone who's very snarky. I'm someone who has a very, dark and juvenile sense of humor. Like that there's so many parts about me, and that this is simply a part of what makes me who I am, if that makes sense.
I can definitely attest to your dark and juvenile sense of humor, for sure.
Yeah.
which is one of the things I certainly love about you.
Sure.
But no, that beautifully put. And just from my own experiences, I can definitely relate to a lot of what you talked about as far as being a storyteller in this overall space, obviously coming at it from a very different angle. But as far as with feeling through is really interesting. I mean, there's a whole nother discussion that we can have and certainly get into today or another time around me being someone who's sighted and hearing, representing someone who's deaf-blind in a film, and obviously I did all the homework I could do in connecting with Helen Keller Services and the Helen Keller National Center, and also just really getting to know the community as much as I could, not be out of obligation because I wanted to, because I was curious, and then got to connect with awesome people like you and many other people who became good friends of mine too. But I think something that was really interesting in taking the film around, and thankfully we've gotten a really great universal response, from the general public, from a lot of people we've been able to share it with in the deaf-blind community and other disability communities. But something that has come up sometimes, and it never is, honestly, there's been very little pushback or a backlash on anything, but there have been a lot of times where people go, oh, you know what? There's a lot of deafblind people who do this or do that. You should have done that in the film. And I'm like, you know what? There just needs to be more films about people who are deafblind, because this was about one very specific person who's, I mean, it's ultimately it's not about deafblindness. It's about two different people connecting. But this was representing one very specific person who's deafblind that wasn't meant to represent all people who are deafblind. And I would say to these people, your point is so well taken, because there needs to be more stories that include people who are deafblind, so that we can get the breadth of diversity within that community, and that no singular story has the pressure to encapsulate an entire community through like one character or one story. So that's, again, as we get to the fact that with storytelling, particularly storytelling that's meant to capture something very current and be told to lots of people, you're always operating within a very specific context. Mm-hmm. And that context also means that when I go to make a film that includes a deafblind character played by a deafblind actor, I have to be aware. It's not the driving force of all the decisions I make, but I have to be aware that this is a first, that a deafblind actor is starring in a film. There's a responsibility to being aware of that context. I mean, if we go like 1,000 years in the future, if we're all still here on planet Earth and all together, and movies are still a thing or whatever form they're in, and there have been 1 million movies with people who are deafblind and everyone else in them, there's a different language there. There's a different way of telling those stories at that point. But right now, you talked before, you used the word of, in certain ways, of like pioneering Usher type 3, but it's also pioneering in a way storytelling, very specifically storytelling that deals with the deafblind community, because there's been so few stories, particularly movies, that deal with that experience. So it's like, you talked about, how the internet can be and social media, like as just a person, how do you juggle, because you do it so well, how do you juggle being who you are and showing up as who you are, and knowing that as a public figure who is deafblind, that always, whether you want it or not, carries a degree of responsibility? How do you juggle those two things?
Mm-hmm. It's a good question. I think the amount of work that I've done on myself, and remember, I'm a psychotherapist, so this is what I do all day long, is just sort of evaluating emotions and kind of really trying to get the root of whatever it is that I'm feeling, or anybody is feeling for that matter. And I think that what I've found is that no matter what your situation is, the more confident you are, the more comfortable you are with whatever your circumstances are, the more comfortable other people will be communicating with you in whatever form that is. The more comfortable people will be in having some sort of interaction with you. And I've also recognized that part of being in this deaf-blind space means that I go to every place and everything knowing that it is likely not going to be accommodating for me. That I'm going to have to be creative, that I'm going to have to think outside of the box, that I'm going to have to make it work. And all of these things that don't have that sort of accessibility or inclusivity, that it doesn't drag me down. Because if I were to focus on everything that wasn't, able for me to access, I think it would be a very depressing way of living. And so I do the best that I can to try to create awareness and comfort in other people. But part of that is living in discomfort. And maybe it's sort of this sick, I don't want to say a sick pleasure, but I have learned to be incredibly comfortable in discomfort. Whether it's climbing Mount Kilimanjaro or swimming from Alcatraz to shore without being able to hear or see, these are things that it's like developing that resilience and that comfort with being uncomfortable. I think that when we see people who A, are different than us, but B, who we see with any type of different ability, we immediately assume that maybe they're, that we can't communicate with them, and that they're not entirely human, that there's something that like is unreachable. And I don't agree with that. I think that we all have to be incredibly uncomfortable in order to make progress, in order to sort of continue to develop this comfort with discomfort. So I don't know how great I am at it, but I'm certainly comfortable with other people being uncomfortable with my situation, and I don't take it personally. That's kind of their stuff, not mine. And but it has been a process of getting to that place.
You know, as you mentioned in that you are a psychotherapist, you are also an extreme athlete. You were starting to kind of talk about those in that beautiful response, but how did, I guess, to not to try to make connections for you there, but I can't help but feel like that both of those aspects of yourself are directly connected to a lot of what you detail in your memoir of kind of your experiences as a girl and a young woman, and then a woman coming into her own identity and needing to both understand yourself really intimately and also really get comfortable being uncomfortable. Was the therapist side and the extreme athlete side like kind of directly birthed from that experience, or what if any connection is there?
Yeah, so I think that so one thing again that people likely don't know about me, and if they read my book, first of all, thank you. I always assume that my book is either sort of sitting by the side of someone's toilet as toilet reading, or maybe it's been donated to Goodwill. But in any case, I think that for me, so I was in an accident when I was 18, and I broke just about everything in my body, and I fell out of a window. And that was my first real sort of experience with having a disability. I was in a wheelchair for 4 months. I've lived with chronic pain ever since. And so it's funny that, the deaf blindness is part of it, but this is another part of me and I had to quite literally rebuild myself. And I think that, so having to rebuild my body after all of the injuries I sustained, and then getting this diagnosis, what sort of evolved was me not only taking care of my body because I had to, but that I don't have control over the fact that I'm losing my vision. But I do have control over how I take care of myself. There's no, treatment for the vision loss. And, I know that that's even a controversial topic itself. But I can control what I eat and how I nourish my body and how I take care of myself. And I can also control my exercise and meditating and practicing yoga and the things that give me a sense of empowerment. And there is something that gives me this sense of taking the power back in some way when there's so much that's so completely out of my control. It's also how I manage my anxiety and stress. That's just, for me, exercise has been a key part of that, sort of therapy for me. Now, therapy has been a huge part of my ability to come to terms and really analyze my identity and my experience in the world, and learn to become comfortable with myself. And so I think that I love listening to people's stories. I love being able to share in very difficult and painful and also in joyful times in people's lives. One of the things that I love about being a psychotherapist, and even a deaf-blind psychotherapist, is that if you were to see me on the street and I were standing there with my cane waiting for, like the light to change, I think that I would be the last person that anybody would ever assume that they should go to for help. I think I would be the last person that someone would point to say, oh, she must be a psychotherapist. She would be someone who would be able to help me with whatever the emotional stress is or the trauma that I'm dealing with in my life. And I love that, as weird as that sounds, because it's just another testament to the way that we sort of judge and preconceive who someone is or what they're capable of or whether they can help us or not. And the fact that I am standing there, and if it is sort of a very busy, noisy, crazy street, and now because there is less traffic, those of us who have hearing because of assistive listening, we rely on the traffic to tell us when we can cross, right? So I may need more help from someone. And that reciprocity of being someone who can really help others and yet also needing tremendous help from people, really is incredibly humbling. It is just a very humbling experience.
Yeah, there's been some really great articles that I've seen written recently about specifically in New York City, people who are blind or low vision. And I'm sure there's been some also about the deaf-blind community, but I've just happened to see more about blind or low vision. Navigating the city during the times of COVID is a very different experience. Normal cues that are there, like you were describing, are not there as much or in a different way, and kind of learning to re-navigate is something that I've read some really interesting articles on that. I'm wondering, just specifically being a therapist during the last year, where there's been tremendous challenges for basically everyone in a number of ways. What's it been like for you this last year? And I'm also curious, do you find yourself as someone who that people with disabilities or people who are deafblind seek out because of that other level of understanding of their experience? Is that something that happens for you?
Yeah, so it's interesting because, when COVID started, one of the things that happened is that they sort of lifted some of the laws about being able to practice in like different states. So I have more people with either vision loss or, who are hard of hearing or deaf-blind who have reached out to me to do therapy because we're all in this virtual world, right? And we now have sort of the legal jurisdiction to work with people outside of our states. So it has actually provided that opportunity to work with more people who have, either similar types of disabilities or different disabilities than I do, because I think that I often hear the biggest struggle is finding a therapist who really gets it. I think that sometimes we think that therapists are like these all-knowing people who have done all of the research and the studying and the clinical work, and they know the best answers. And I find that actually the best therapists are the ones who have been through some serious stuff themselves and have that vulnerability and humility. But so yes, the number of people I work with who have deafblindness or who have disabilities in general has increased during COVID. COVID has been tremendously difficult on all of us. It's been even more difficult, I think, on the deafblind community. And I think that this time, like everybody else for me, has been exhausting. But this is why now more than ever, having this self-care practice has been so important. I think we hear a lot about mindfulness and self-care and whatever, but it's something that I have to do because there's such a thing as what we call compassion fatigue, where you hear so much of people going through so many different things that at some point it's like, I'm done. Like, I can't even hear anybody else, suffering or whatever. And so I definitely make sure that I meditate every morning and I exercise, but I'm human like everybody else, and I have my limits. So I really try to not become a therapy factor. I really try to do more meaningful work with the people that I work with.
Mm. Yeah, that's definitely now more than ever. Those practices are definitely needed and important.
Mm-hmm.
As being that we are in a new year with some pretty significant changes that have occurred just recently, with the obviously the inauguration being a very specific sign of it, and a little bit more right and more of a prospect moving forward of obviously vaccines are getting administered, albeit slower than we'd hope, but that there are a lot more people getting vaccinations. What are you hoping to see over the next year?
Well, I think one of the hardest things that we have had to deal with is a lack of expectation management. That it's funny because I was talking with a friend maybe like last weekend, and she was saying that she and her husband were laughing hysterically because they were thinking about last year in March when when we were told that we would have to stay home for 3 months, and how brave they felt and like, we can do this, having no idea that we were going to be here a year later, and just laughing at the bravery they thought they had at the time, right? And I mean, listen, a whole other conversation is uh, about the last administration we have. It's deplorable. I never knew that I was somebody that was capable of of murder until Trump was in office. I've never had such a visceral response to anyone in my life. But I will say that our expectations were not managed. And, I sort of think that with this new administration, I think that we're all very hopeful, but it's sort of like having a breakup with a really abusive significant other. And now we're not ready to trust again. Like, we need to recover. And how do you do that and yet move into this new era? So I guess what I'm really hopeful for this year is that people will have the room and the time and the space to heal from the tremendous betrayal and loss that we have experienced on such a grand scale. And I really, personally, I really hope that people will get vaccinated soon, but I think that we're really going to be in this space for most of this year. And I think we all need to be prepared and manage our expectations and learn to stop looking so far into the future for when things finally open up, and actually take the time and space now to think about what it is that we need to do to keep ourselves going during this incredibly trying and difficult time. And also write about the things that we maybe took for granted and that we're very much looking forward to once we do have a greater opening of sort of, our communities and the world. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I think that one of the things that we need to continue to do now, which is very difficult, we need to continue managing our expectations, that it's going to take us time. We didn't get into this mess overnight.
You talked about how this time, through the lens of being a therapist, how you've been able to work with people remotely that you wouldn't normally have the opportunity to work with. There's also been some things that I've heard in specific cases of the fact that, one of the silver linings of this time has been certain things are a lot more accessible for certain groups of people that hadn't been accessible in ways that hadn't been accessible before. Have you come across that in your own life, not just necessarily personally, but people that you work with or connected with, that like some of the potential benefits of accessibility during this time and how that might, look moving forward, even as we at whatever point emerge from this and kind of get back to whatever normal is?
Mm-hmm. So it's a good question. I don't think we will ever go back to normalcy. Going through something like this that we've gone through, there's no way to ever go back. We will never be able to sort of return to something. It's just like when somebody has any type of, if they have, a psychotic break, or if they have any type of, real serious illness, you don't ever come out of this and not be sort of permanently affected. Now, that's not necessarily always in a negative way, but it will be interesting to see how we as in communities evolve. I think that the accessibility, there's been more of a focus on creating more accessibility because we do find ourselves in this virtual space. But I will tell you that, like everyone else, I think in this community, I still struggle and constantly am trying to, technology is very flawed. It's made tremendous progress, but we still have a very long way to go. And so I'm eager, I still have to constantly invert from, they have smart invert now, but I constantly have to invert my colors from white on black or yellow on black to, just for so many different things. And so I'm really eager and encouraged and hopeful that we will be able to continue making progress. I think that there's a lot of really promising stuff that has changed, but I think we still have I want us to work more from a place of momentum and not from a place of, okay, we've created this, that's all done. I think that there's so much that we still can do. So I don't know if that's quite the answer you're looking for, but I do think that this has created an opportunity for people to really be aware of the access that we need. And I think more importantly, I think we've all realized that at some point in our lives, we will all end up with some form of disability, right? And so creating this access now will really help so many people even down the road. Yeah.
As there's so many other aspects to your life we can't get to today because of time. So I'll obviously twist your arm and have you come back on here another time. your public speaking, more into, you as a trainer and extreme athlete and many other things that you do. But just kind of with the final, few minutes we have here, is there anything we didn't talk about today, or any kind of like closing thoughts that you'd like to ruminate on?
Oh man, where do we even start? I mean, I'm curious. I don't know. I know we don't have time for questions. I'm so curious. I think that part of what's been so difficult about this time is, even just like not being able to embrace people, not being able to sort of touch them. And I know we all talk about this when we hear it, but I think in the beginning I was used to it, but now I really feel that deprivation. And part of why Monkey and I sort of, she gets way too much love from me, poor thing. But I do feel like this community, because we are such a tactile community, that we really have been tested during this time. And so I really hope that to all of my sort of deafblind, compatriots out there, that just to say that you're not alone, that we're in this together, even though we are very separate during this time. So, I mean, listen, there's plenty of things we could ruminate about, but so maybe I'll leave that to you.
No, that's a beautiful sentiment to end on. And, I encourage all of you watching, if you haven't already, to read Rebecca's memoir, Not Fade Away. It's really, I was, again, I think you write with such the way in which you tell your story is, I think, really accessible and universal for anyone, and anyone's experience. And that's what I took away from it. And, I'm excited to see what happens with this movie. I'll certainly be following along closely and definitely like bugging you for updates on it. But, it's going to be an interesting journey. And I think, whatever happens from it, it's an important step along this journey. It's an important step along the journey of, representing communities and individuals within those communities that haven't been represented before, and finding ways to do that. And I'm sure there'll be, successes from it and things that will be looked at to improve upon in the next one. And that's inevitable with anything we do. But it's definitely, I'm really excited and happy for it to be happening, because it needs to happen. Like, there needs to be more stories like yours being told in film.
Mm-hmm. I wanted, Doug, you just saying that reminded me of one thing that I think is important that I want to bring up. And that is when my book first came out, I went, to Barnes and Noble or various stores just to see if they carried it. And when I went there, every time, even though it had just been released, they said, oh yeah, they looked it up in the computer. Yeah, we have one copy. It's in disability. It's downstairs to the very back of the store. And that to me I was so disappointed that it was sort of, again, pigeonholed into disability, that this was a book that came out that was just as worthy. And I think that the human condition and the human experience is universal, no matter what your circumstances are. And so I was so frustrated that as soon as my book came out, it's like, yep, let's throw this in disability in the back of the store where, very few people look, because I do think that that's another way in which representation needs to come out. We have to have more people represented on the front tables of the store, and not be sort of typecasted because it falls into this category.
I love that. Well, you're already a part of that evolution, and I'm sure we'll continue to be so. So excited to see how that unfurls. And again, so happy. We were long overdue for this, but it was well worth the wait. You're just such an exceptional person and become a really great friend. And I'm very much looking forward to getting back to New York so that we can hang out again. And believe me, I'm gonna need one of your workouts when I get back.
Right, every time Doug comes to New York.
So I'm gonna need one of those.
Every time you come to New York, I drag you for a workout, and he's like, "Oh, geez, how am I gonna get out of this?" Every single time, and you're such a doll. You do it with me.
Well, I need it this time, so I'm looking forward to that. And thank you for all of you tuned in today. We'll be back next week, I believe, at our normal time. Looking forward to it. And yeah, again, Rebecca, I'm going to twist your arm and have you back on here at some point in the future.
You got it. Thanks so much, Doug.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.